Yes, I'm a yoga teacher. Yes, I'm studying to be an Ayurvedic doctor. I meditate twice a day. I do yoga. For me, compassion and kindness is everything. But, I don't believe in toxic positivity. So I think it was this whole journey of really honoring the truth of grief, good and bad, because the only way you can elevate yourself to the next level is if you live in authenticity.
So inside of your book, let's dive into your book and some principles, perhaps, that our listeners can use as tools for anyone that is going through this. How does your protocol, how does the book go?
Sweta Vikram is the author of the book, The Loss That Binds Us. And this topic is something that all of us have to deal with at some stage in our life, dealing with grief and the loss of a loved one. And in this conversation, we deep dive into ways in which we can learn to cope with loss and navigate our grief and have more open conversations around this topic, which is so often shunned. She is an absolute expert in this field, working as a coach, a guide, and an expert to many, many podcasts and corporations and healing institutions, helping people to be able to deal with this most personal of issues. I hope you enjoy this elevated conversation with Sweta Vikram.
Well, thank you so much for coming on our podcast, Elevated Conversations. It's such a pleasure to meet you and to welcome you into this space, because we really love talking about healing, elevating, and moving through these experiences of the emotion. And we know that you're very interested in that. So tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to this kind of realm.
So I'll start with this picture. It's not for the purpose of promotions, but for people to understand where I'm coming from. So this book called The Loss That Binds Us, it came out on April 2nd.
Congratulations.
And, thank you so much. Thank you. And so last year in 2023, out of nowhere, within 2 days, both my father and my father-in-law passed away. So they weren't, like, I'm not saying if they're old, it's okay, not at all. But I'm just saying they were in the mid-70s. So it wasn't like they were 150 and we were expecting this, right?
Yes.
So it just took us by a surprise that we'd seen them 4 weeks ago. They were okay. And my father was my friend, my confidant, my critic, safe space, the place where I gossiped about, weird family members, like, all of that. And he would always say, we need to normalize grief. And we need to talk about these things, because he would talk about his unprocessed grief from losing a sibling when he was younger. But, man from that generation, no one held the space for that, right? I don't think he knew how to hold space for that. But then, fortunately, given the work that I was doing, he was able to share all that with me. And we come back in June of last year, and I'm still processing all these losses. And mind you, this is my dad's my dad passes away. 2 days later, my father-in-law passes away. On the 4th day is my mom's 9th death anniversary. So we are like, and my brother and I are like, oh my God, there's one day in between. Who's going to go now? And like, dark humor is our way we roll. But, we didn't know what hit us. And then I realized, like, where do I turn to find what hit us? Yes, I'm a yoga teacher. Yes, I'm studying to be an Ayurvedic doctor. But there's nothing out there that just tells me I am angry and I'm sad and I'm hopeless, yet I'm grateful. There's nothing for somebody like me out there. Everything is very pedantic. It's from people who on the other side, like, you too shall experience this bliss. But I'm like, right now, I want to slap someone. Where is the material on that? Like, grief can create a monster, and doesn't mean you act on it, but there's so many thoughts. And something that I realized, there were sides to myself I didn't know existed. I meditate twice a day. I do yoga. For me, compassion and kindness is everything. Oh, the number of times I mentally slap people. I will not act on the violence, but it doesn't mean the thought doesn't cross your mind. But you don't talk about these things in the world, because then you're judged for, because everything has to be highlighted real in your life, right? We don't hold space for the real dark stories. And when I started to write this book, and there were some, the pre-release readers were some psychiatrists, and they were like, you're giving us permission to hold space for our grief. I was like, that wasn't the intention, but I'm so glad. So I think it became like a grief manual that helps people from day one. And every individual is different. Their grief is going to be different. But, from those dark places of like attending Thanksgiving or Diwali or Christmas and seeing all these full families and knowing you'll never have that. So, that happiness for them, but that emptiness for yourself, it's normal. No one said that. So, from that to how do you keep their memory alive? And it's such a coincidence. Today is my parents' wedding anniversary. So,
Wow.
like, I think of it as like, they're looking over. So it's also coming to that side. I am an optimist, but, I don't believe in toxic positivity. So I think it was this whole journey of really honoring the truth of grief, good and bad, because the only way you can elevate yourself to the next level is if you live in authenticity.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that and diving deep into that. And we know everything happens for a reason. There's contracts that we all sign up for if we believe in that, and before we incarnate into these beautiful bodies. And, these are trigger points to help and have a ripple elsewhere. And perhaps these two significant things that, happened in your life and your family's life has triggered you to start this book, and to then have that trigger to go and ripple out to help the other people that are going through similar experiences. Because you are right, there isn't a grief manual. There isn't a grief manual. So inside of your book, let's dive into your book and some principles perhaps that our listeners can use as tools for anyone that is going through this. How does your protocol, how does the book go? Because we haven't read it yet and we'd love to.
So one of the things that I recommend to my clients as an Ayurvedic doctor, or even otherwise, is be honest. Stay honest to yourself, because if you start to yo-yo trying to please others, grief is heavy enough. No one says I'm grieving. Grief is heavy. It just brings you down. And imagine trying to wear those garbs of I am this and I'm also that is just adding weight. So wherever you are on your journey, acknowledge it. And once you've acknowledged it, you're not putting any energy into fighting what you feel, then maybe seek help, whether it's talking to a grief counselor, therapist, an Ayurvedic doctor, whatever feels truest to you. It's always coming back to what does feel truest to me. And for some people, if self-harming behaviors feel truest, definitely get help, because, that's not you, that's your grief. And also reminding people, I was very fortunate that I was extremely close to my father. And I think it's a privilege. Because, there are people who have estranged relationships. There are people who didn't get to say goodbyes. I was able to spend my father's last 5 days in this realm. The entire family was there, like my brother's family, my husband and I. We fed him, I read to him, I cracked jokes. I'm a wise ass, so always talking smack. With my mom, when she, the same thing. She was very young. She was 66. We get a call, she's not well. My husband and I catch a flight. She was gone midway. So just knowing there is no comparison in grief, there is no hierarchy. Can we not compete? And let's not tell others whose grief matters more. Someone who's lost a job or their marriage has the same right over their grief as someone like me who's lost, both their parents, or my mom-in-law who's lost a husband. So it's all of those. First, be a decent human being. Like, yes, it's about you, but it's also about others. You're not the only one who's impacted by grief. Like, I've had aunts and uncles, in the beginning, really sweet. Like, they wouldn't talk as much about dad. And then I said to them, guys, it's okay. You loved him too. We don't. And they were like, oh, yeah, we really miss him. And I said, I know how lucky was he that he was so loved. And just because he was my father doesn't mean my grief is more important than yours. He was your brother-in-law. He was your brother. So firstly, honoring, like, just being a decent human being, then coming back to your truth of, this is what I'm feeling. If you've been stuck in anger for like 6 months, that's scary. Being angry for a defined period is good. It's a healthy emotion. But if it's leading to some kind of addiction, some unhealthy coping mechanisms, complete detachment from the world around you, and if that's not your inherent nature, those are all signs for, you need help. And there's no shame in asking for help. A lot of people will argue with me over this, like, but this is how I cope. But I'm like, if you don't give yourself the 1 or 2 days is fine. Go be down in that pecan pie if that's what you want, or if a bottle of wine is what heals you, but it's not. You have to get to the root. So at the start, yes, pamper yourself if whatever your modality is, if you're not hurting yourself. But you know what? No. Don't ask yourself what you want, give yourself what you need. And routine creates good health, but it also creates good memories. So for even when I was shuttling for 2 weeks between two cities, two ICUs, two homes, not knowing if I left one place, who's going to die, that kind of a feeling. But for me, that Uber ride was when I meditated. Instead of taking the elevator, I would climb up 11 floors, 7 floors at my dad's and that one, my in-laws. But I'm like, that's my only time when I can focus on what I am feeling. Because my nature is such, and as a healer, I'm always focused on the others. And then people are like, oh yeah, she's a strong personality, she'll manage. So it's also that burden along with grief. This is the cloak that I'm wearing. She can handle it.
Yes.
Right. So just also having these honest conversations about no, like shower, something as basic as shower, eat, bathe, disconnect when you want. You don't have to answer every phone call. Don't have to answer every text. I had like a pre-written text message, which I showed my husband and my brother. I was like, I don't want to hurt others, but I don't want to get, so I would send them, thank you so much for reaching out. I really appreciate this. I don't have the bandwidth to get on a phone call right now. Can I just call you back once I'm settled in New York? So it was never like, I don't care, but also like, if whatever energy I had to give it to the people who are alive in the two families and those who had passed on to honor their memories. So it's okay to be a little selfish, and it's not really selfish, it's self-care. And it's radical when you're grieving. The other thing that I do talk about is like how to celebrate them, say their names, celebrate their anniversary. Like today, tonight, my husband and I, there's no cooking. We're ordering in Thai food. My parents love that. We'll get a pastry and cut that. And, like you have to celebrate them. Grief doesn't mean it's there. It's this little rock that's always in your pocket and then makes you feel there is something. But, there can be lighter moments to like share a joke about them. So go through that journey and know that you'll revert. You might get stuck in some places. Ask for help. Grief is heavy, but you can find lightness within.
Wow, I love that. I love that. And in your work with Ayurvedic medicine, does it talk at all about how unresolved grief or trauma might show up in a person? Like maybe there's something they haven't addressed from, let's say, 20 or 30 years ago. How do these things sometimes manifest?
How many days do we have for this conversation?
Well, it's the common ones,
Yeah. So from an Ayurvedic perspective, 80% of the diseases start in the manas, which is the mind. And even Western medicine will tell you repressed emotions, unresolved emotions, trauma, intergenerational trauma will manifest as a disease or could manifest as a disease. There are more women than men who have autoimmune because more women than men have repressed emotions. So there is all this data backing it up. It's just that Ayurveda has been saying the same thing for 5,000 years. Everything starts with the mind, and there's a mind-gut connection. So how we feel is how we'll feed ourselves, and how we feed ourselves will impact how we think. And because if the trauma has not even resolved, not been handled at all, not been paid attention to, you don't know what triggers you. And very often, from an Ayurvedic as well as Western perspective, they'll tell you if you react to small things in a bigger way, that's a sign your nervous system is dysregulated. So, the nervous system is taking on all of this stuff, and that one little thing could just, like, I'll give you an example about myself. When my mom passed away, I was always much younger, in my 30s, shocked what the heck had happened. And my yoga practice was about being a certain body type, less of a mind practice, because, you go through that journey of what yoga means to you, right? And so when we get to my dad's, my dad's driver, so I'd packed some food and given for his family because he was just and I was like, you need to bring back those boxes. And that is not me. I am really not attached to materialistic, especially Tupperware, like, come on. But I was like, these boxes back. And that was my grief, because I'd lost my mom so suddenly I could lose those boxes. It's much later when I started doing this work as a healer, not just as like somebody who shows up to a yoga studio. I was like, oh, that's what it was. Or even asking, like, hiring a cleaner to come in every 2 hours to clean bathrooms, because, we had so many, it was India, so many visitors, and some level of hygiene, right? If there's so many people in the house. And later on, yes, it was about cleanliness, but it was also about wanting to control in something in my life when I could control nothing. See, it wasn't like a big trauma, yet it was a big trauma, and it showed up in these small things. So not everything would be explosive for people. And that's when they think, oh no, it's just the grief. No, it's grief that got triggered because of an experience that we said, shh, put it on the side. And
Yeah.
that could, for instance, in my case, I caught it, right? And I'm blessed that I don't have a mental health issue. If I had anxiety or depression or bipolar, any of those range of emotions, and put grief into that, you don't know where it'll take you, right? For a lot of people, the anxiety would be, I don't know who I'll lose next. And
Mm.
for someone who's battling depression and they've not navigated that, then they're like, what's the point of anything? Why should I leave my couch? Because if I step out, I might die. So that's one extreme. But the point being, like, it's so important. Then it can turn into physical diseases or lifestyle diseases. And from an Ayurvedic perspective, like I said, like most diseases start from the mind. So name a disease and there's a mind connection. And there's 6 stages to a disease. So in my case, like telling the guy to bring back that Tupperware was one. But if I had not caught it at the start, it could have turned into a full-blown something else, even becoming a hoarder, right?
Mm.
Hoarding emotions, hoarding things, hoarding memories. That means I'm dishonoring those who are alive and just hanging on to those who have passed away.
Mm. I love it. It's very up our alley as to dissecting patterns and triggers. That's what we are very much on the forefront of in our life and have been for the last 5 years since having an awakening. And it's like hard sometimes to see it when you're in it. But if you
Right.
get clever at the game, and the game is spotting the trigger and spotting the negative emotion and trying to track where it started, if you can in this lifetime, because we often do bring through intergenerational patterns through, and that's when we can get lost. But if I truly believe that if you've been handed that card, it's because you can handle it, right? It's not, it's something that it's a challenge as an old soul to, okay, I'm going to, give myself these challenges to get through the game, to elevate. That's going to be like, how I'm going to get through this experience. And it's like a challenge in life, I believe, because we only assign meaning to what we believe in, right? So it's all belief systems at the end of the day. And the belief system of having control over the bathroom in your mind helps you feel safe, right? And that's all you can control right now,
Right. And that's all I could process in the moment.
Yes. So when did you start to realize these things? I mean, this is 12 months since it's June now, and this was 12 months ago. So how did you, to help some of our viewers understand the process when you're in the grief, how did you start to unpick it? Was it several weeks after, or was it just a channeling thought that started coming to you once, the dust had settled?
So, as I was joking with a friend, like I said, dark humor is how my brother and I roll, just like my dad. A friend of mine lost her grandmother last week, and I said to her, I have senioritis. I've lost both my parents, so I've got all the tips. Tell me what you need. So for me, this started 10 years ago when my mom passed away.
Okay.
It hit me from nowhere. When both your parents are alive, and if you have a healthy relationship with them, every family is dysfunctional in its own way. But a place that I would call home, visit twice a year when they would come visit me, I was like, it's a fairly balanced family, right? But I remember up until she passed away, I was like I was an adult, but I was also allowed to be a child. And then when she passed away, so my reactions were that of a child, like how can you take my mom away? Keep my bathroom clean, right? It's when you think of it that way. So the deeper I got into my practice, then I started doing yoga teacher training. I started working with trauma. I started doing trauma-informed yoga. I think so the deeper I got into my practice, and people always ask me, what do you mean when you get deeper into your practice? I said, it's not the asana, it's the texts, it's the discussions, it's the Yoga Sutra. It's all of it. It's the Bhagavad Gita. It's what you learn from your classmates, from your teachers, from your peers. It's what you disagree with. So I think it was all of it combined, because I realized I was angry, and I am not so angry. Like I have a lightness to my personality, but I was stuck in that anger phase, which didn't mean I was hurting others. I was hurting myself because I was angry. So I'm like, if I'm fuming so much on the outside at the helplessness of it, what must be happening on the inside? So I started asking these questions. And, when we were doing like the Yoga Sutra discussion or Bhagavad Gita or Patanjali, all of that, I realized I wasn't alone. So finding community is very important. And given again, I'm a type A or Pitta in Ayurveda description. So taking charge is the way I know how to be. So I became the gatekeeper. I'm younger than my brother. So I'm the youngest in the family, yet I became the gatekeeper. So it was just, I grew up by 10 years in those first 2 months, and I didn't know how to handle it. So to anchor myself, I turned to yoga. It wasn't like this is how I'll find it, but the more I got into it, the more I found peace, the more I started to understand people. So by the time it came to my dad, everybody was like, how are you so calm? How have you not fallen sick? Because I used to not sleep at nights. At nights, I would stay up with my dad because that's the time he would, mumble something. And I was making notes because I was like, I will never get this. I know you're going to go any day. I would talk to him. He was like a child at that time. Then during the day, sometimes I was going to my in-laws. So, and when everyone would tell me my brother was really concerned, you'll fall sick. And I said, it's all manas, it's the mind. I've told my mind, please listen to the body. I've told my body, please listen to the mind. This is a temporary arrangement. We have to cooperate. I cannot afford to fall sick. And I didn't. So I think it's practice. It's also living in awareness. And I'm going to use this word. I hope it's not offensive to people, the BS. It's asking yourself what your BS story is. Like we always call out others, but it's also asking yourself what my BS story is. Bless you. Are we expecting too much out of people? Is this even fair? And I've realized people are very self-consumed and they are self-centered. But why do I have these expectations? Then maybe I need to scale back. So the difference in the 10 years has been like literally, has been like, I'm so angry. Why is this happening to me? To this happens, how can I help others and myself?
Beautiful.
My body language, you notice, might have changed by the end of it. It's this stuff happens. How do we find it? Still feels really terrible to, my birthday, our wedding anniversary. I became an Ayurvedic doctor. My parents were not there, all these milestones. So I'm also very aware that I will get triggered. And grief is the price we pay for love. But it doesn't have to be devastating for like 5 days. It might be in that moment you find ways of holding space and honoring your grief.
I love that, because a lot of people are just distracting themselves from their emotional purge. And the body, I love how you were talking about the body, like, body, listen to the mind, and mind, you've got to cooperate with the body. So everyone needs to get along here, because we're often not communicating with our body at all or acknowledging our body. It's always an outward expression of finding something to satisfy us, rather than, self-healing and talking to the organs and talking to the mind and the central nervous system, like you were suggesting, and being cooperative in the body. And honoring that, because this is the instrument. The instrument is to play in the life, and yeah. But
I must say, as I listen to your beautiful story and your insights, it really feels like a reflection of a wise soul. Because, in the first experience through the loss of your mother, you move to, I can relate to it because, when I've lost family members that I'm close to, my mother and father are both still alive and I get along with them very well. I would probably see them every second weekend, right? There's lots of family dinners. We all get along, beautiful family. But there's been grief and there's been loss, right, within the family. And early on, when I was personally going through grief and loss, when you talked about you were angry, I reflected for a moment, and sometimes it's just angry at the universe. It's like, this just sucks. This is not fair. I'm a good person. Why did you do this to me, universe? It doesn't seem like, it's not like I've got bad karma and I knew I had it coming. It's like, this really sucks. And I have learned, and I've observed that you seem to have moved through that, this is happening to me. And with the death of your father, you felt it, but very quickly moved through it to, although this is happening for me. There's a way in which I can move through this and learn the lesson and feel the grief, but reflect on the memory of him, and to mention him with happiness and joy within the family still, to honor him. But also, you write this beautiful book. You're a pillar to other people, guiding them through clearing their loss. And I think it's very admirable. I think, it's a reflection of you and how you've grown as a soul through this lifetime.
I do really appreciate that. There are bad days and I have my moments, and bad days, it's oftentimes when you lose both your parents, which I didn't realize until dad was alive, your identity changes forever. So I am seeing my cousins or my husband's cousins who are older than we are, their parents are alive. So am I their generation? Like, who do I represent now? It's like, it's weird. So, or if they visit, and if I visit India, like, am I calling them up? Do they reach out? Like, how does, like, when parents are alive, there's a protocol of this is what you do and you matter. And then it's not like, it feels like people are shitty, but it's not really true. People, they've moved on too. Like I was telling my husband this morning, how many people remember it's their wedding anniversary? It doesn't make them bad, but that's how quickly dead people are forgotten. And I think so in moments like that, and one of my best friends, the one who lost her grandmother, she remembered and she messaged me, I'm thinking of you today and very happy wedding anniversary. So I'm like, that's when you have to bring yourself back to, you still have love. For what you lost, you also have this. And I also look at losing both the parents at an relatively earlier stage in life is, it's also helping me detox and cleanse my life, because there were too many people, and there are sometimes we all indulge people, our parents think we should indulge because you want to keep the peace and you also want them to be happy. It's not a daily interference, right? And I'm like, no, if we are not aligned, I want you to be healthy and happy, but we don't have to move around the same orbit. And I think so all of that can be make you feel really light, but it can also start off as being heavy. So to anyone who is listening, like it's never linear, and it comes in phases, and you feel you've done the work and you're doing great. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I don't feel like this is hard. And all of that is okay.
And it's like moving into acceptance. My father died when I was 8. He committed suicide. I didn't really deal with that grief. That was just suppressed as a little girl, because it was almost like not welcomed in the house because my mother wasn't coping with anything around my father at that stage, And so this suppressed emotion, until you start to look at it, and you're right, the anger came up. It's like, why'd you leave me, And then you go through this other phase of like, he's my savior, like there's all these, it was like a washing machine of emotions because I had completely suppressed them, And now it's just like this beautiful relationship with spirit and his spirit. And he'll come in from time to time wearing some thongs, which is flip-flops. And when I see this little symbol in my, in my meditations, I know Dad's around me and there. And it's beautiful now, like a full in acceptance of that. But it is a journey. It's a full journey. And, from time to time, it'd be easier if I did have that protection and that figure there. But it's like, it's an interesting facet, grief. There's a lot to it.
Absolutely. And I think, I have two friends who lost. Firstly, I'm really sorry to hear about your dad. And when you're that young, both of these friends said that, you have no idea what's hit you. You just know that one person is missing and the other person doesn't, the one who's alive is absent. So you're just trying to cope in a home where it almost feels like one is humanly alive yet absent, the other is just not in the realm. And the grief comes up maybe when you have your own kids or your big milestones in life. And that's when, even for them, the healing started when they were like older, not when they were kids. And I was like, and no one talks about that grief that a child is going through. Because even then it's just a comparison, but she lost her husband, but that child also lost a parent. And I think it goes back to literally the pathology of the mindset and the conditioning of the world, where everything needs to be highlighted real. Unless you use the hashtag living my best life, no one is holding space. And which is very unfortunate because we all go through cycles.
Mm-hmm.
And for the people who just portray all the great stuff, that's humanly impossible. So that means you've not dealt with your grief either. If you're trying to portray 100% of your life, it's so perfect.
Well, it's the ego structure, right? The ego wants to pretend that it's all good and nothing to see over here, but it's the person's responsibility to, you know, take action and to overcome that ego if they desire. And
Right.
God, that the world is waking up and we're coming to a place where these emotional expressions are allowed, because the trapped emotion, like you said, creates density in the body. And
Right.
could this be the reason why, you know, we've seen spikes in cancers and negative health concerns, but we're not admitting the emotion because no one really wants to go there, right?
I had a nurse in the ER once tell me this. She was like, you can't repeat this because I am an ER nurse. But she was like, in most cases, when people are being tested for cancer, it's exactly that. And especially if it's a woman, it's repressed emotions.
Yeah.
And yeah, but we don't have, and we have conversations about vacations, next meal, who won the football game, but it's not like, how are you feeling? And in our house, like my husband and I were grieving at the same time. My brother, his family is grieving. My husband's sister is grieving. My mom, and we all in different countries. My brother and my husband's sister in Singapore. My mom-in-law is in India. We are in New York. And like, how do you grieve as an individual as well as a collective community? Because all families and all individuals are different. So in our home, at least, and I think you both can relate to it. I'm so grateful for the work that I was chosen to do, because I said to my husband, you know, I'm an external processor. Like I talk, I write about grief. You're an internal processor. We should never be saying whose grief matters more.
No.
Grief makes a monster out of all of us. And we are the nastiest to the people we love the most because we feel safe. But at no given time and he was close to my dad, right? And I was fond of my father-in-law. So I'm like, if you were saying I miss like my dad, I shouldn't say, oh, imagine what I'm feeling. He was my father. No competition, no hierarchy. And so it was great that we set the ground rules. So something else for the listeners is very giantly and gently, set your own rules around grief. Don't be rigid, but at least have something in place where people know, like, oh, you know what? I'm maybe crossing the line and I'm hurting myself and somebody else in the process, because you might have all your stuff together and then grief hits you and it's almost like you don't recognize the person, which is yourself.
Yeah. And it's so important how we treat ourselves, because for a lot of people watching this who have dealt with grief, there is a lot of regret in and around the grief, because the person might up and pass and there are unresolved arguments, or they haven't spoken for a long time. There's some sort of resentment or bitterness there. And it's like, this father, well, you know, this person was their father, or this person was their mother or their sister or their brother, etc., you know, and there's like unfinished business. The people pass, and then the person is stuck with this regret that, oh my goodness, I never, you know, got to say to them that I'm sorry, or I never got to say to them, hey, you know, thank you, Dad. I know you were doing the best you could. And even though, you know, you weren't always as supportive and we weren't as close as I would have liked, you know, they don't get to say that, for example. So I think part of a conversation like this that we are having, being real and to inspire people, is to not take the people who are alive that are close to us for granted. We need to sometimes say the words, you know, I love you, or I appreciate you, or you're important to me, or I love our chats and our time together. Like often we think the thought or we feel the emotion, but if we don't express it, like through our words and expression is often a way which really our love and our emotion can properly be exchanged out there into the universe. So I think for a lot of people, that could be one of the things that, you know, they could take away from this conversation. It's like, so therefore from now, I'm going to push myself a little bit more to say thank you, to say I love you, to say I appreciate you. You know, you're such a great friend to someone who might be the best friend, and it's never been said. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And I think I love your word choice of not taking people who are alive for granted, because that's what happens with grief. Some people just don't express, don't reach out, and friendships, relationships are lost because someone also, when you're grieving, you're expecting that little extra, and that's okay. You can just send a text message saying, "How are you doing?" Just checking with you. By the same token, it's with the people who are alive in life. It doesn't have to be a long phone call. It can be like, random example, I saw gelato today and I know chocolate is your flavor. So just thinking of you. Be specific with how you remember that person. But honoring, and even if you, and it's such a great point about like estranged relationships or the last conversation was angry or bitter.
Can't hear you.
Oh,
There
can
we
you
go.
hear?
You're back.
Lost
I
you
don't know what
for a second.
happened.
Just
Oh.
a moment.
You were on such a roll too, so keep going. Yeah,
No,
about
it's
changed relationships.
Yeah, if people have estranged relationships, it's also important to remind yourself, because I have a friend who went through this. And, she had an argument with her mom, and her mom, it's not as a result of that. It was a time she had a heart attack the next day and she passed away. And my friend kept saying to me, I wish I'd heard her out. Like, I wish I'd held space. Like, my mom was screaming about what was happening at the party, and I was tired. And I said to her, then why do you go to these things? Right. And I'm like, you did the best in that moment, staying true to who you are and to the relationship with your mom. It's not like you were rude to her. This is your relationship. You say what's on your mind. That was your banter. And even if you've had an estranged relationship, I think Tony Robbins said this, I'm paraphrasing in one of his talks once, like when he was 13, his mom came at him with a knife. And he was like, if that had not happened, he wouldn't have done the work that he does today. And I always remind people that, like, eventually you'll realize everything happens for a reason, should you choose to believe that. But even not, you can't go back and change the past. So learn to first forgive yourself and the one who's passed away. Like, carrying that stone of anger and grudge and resentment is just as heavy as grief. It pulls you down. So learn to forgive yourself. You didn't know better. Now, if someone tells you they're dying in the next 2 hours and you're screaming at them, that makes you a monster. But if it's just a regular conversation, and we can't live in fear that something is going to happen to someone, so I shouldn't say what's on my mind.
Yes,
That's right.
And and I often joke with people, sometimes the guilt that you give yourself over eating half the cheesecake or drinking the bottle of wine, or when you said you were going to have a clean week or whatever, the guilt that you give yourself about that is actually worse than the activity itself. It's worse than the cake. It's worse than the wine, because that inner loathing and story and punishment and whipping ourselves is
Right.
really like these things that you were talking about that manifest themselves out in a physical condition. So we must be very cautious, and certainly it can be difficult sometimes, but we need to be very cautious, particularly in this area of regret or broken relationships and people handling loss, and then having to deal with now, oh, I should have reached out. I should have done this. I should have done that. And the sting and the churn of regret in the person's stomach is, as you were mentioning, sometimes, needlessly putting themselves through all of this pain for something which at the time was a 50-50. You have an argument with someone, there's always, there's you, there's them. You don't need to take it all on yourself, if you get what I mean.
Absolutely. And also to remember, when we love, we argue. To me, the scariest part, and as I was arguing with my husband last night, I said this to him, like, the scary part in a marriage would be when we never fight, when we never argue, when we never have like a disagreement. It's as if the other person is not invested. When you care, we can't be identical twins in any relationship. And two people, right, even when they are in the closest relationship, the only way to grow is to have opposing views. And I'm not saying 24/7, but like push each other to become a better version for themselves and for you, right? So I said to him, like, until the day one stops arguing is when there is trouble in paradise. And that's true for every relationship. That argument is healthy. It means you care. Like someone, why does a child throw a tantrum? Like, I wanted this and you weren't there for my school play or any of that. Imagine a child saying, that's okay if you weren't there. I would be really worried. And I'd say the same thing about an adult as well. Like, so if you fought, that means you care. If you were disconnected, that's when it's sadness, right? Like, it's so sad that a relationship fell apart.
Mm.
Yeah.
And that's where the growth is in the triggers. Like we used to trigger each other and we're like, work the game out. Okay, it's not them, it's me. I've got to go and process this. And that's the growth. So every now and then, if it shows up, it's like, okay, we're growing again, and that's beautiful. And just last night, I felt like my 10-year-old son was triggering me. And I was just like, oh my God, we're growing again, happening here. There's always a stage and a new learning in this journey. And it's beautiful. Thank you so much for coming on the show today and sharing your wisdom around grief. You're a beautiful soul, beautiful light worker, leading the way, being brave and courageous in this realm. So
Let's
really
hold that book up again.
yeah,
So people
tell
can
us
keep an
where
eye
we
out.
can, the loss that binds us,
Binds
us.
us.
Sorry,
Binds.
binds us.
Lines.
No, it's not you. It's the blurry background.
Yeah. And where can everyone find you, Sweta?
On Amazon. Me? Sorry, my website. You can find me on Amazon. So yeah, my website is shwetavikram.com. If you're looking for Ayurvedic consultations, also around grief consultations rooted in Ayurveda and yoga, because I talk about how doshas play a role in grieving, your health coaching, all of that stuff is on there. But also just to everyone who is tuning in, take care of yourself and be present for the people in your life in general, but also those who are grieving, because grief is not date related. Don't be an absolutionist. And, I visited once and then it's done. It takes nothing to call, to send a message, because this is how we build our community. And the world is going through a loneliness epidemic. Don't contribute to that.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Wonderful to talk to you. Bye-bye, Sweta.
Cut.
I love that conversation. Thank you for sharing so openly, with everyone. I think it's going to inspire a lot of people because, like, let's face it, everyone goes through loss. We all have to deal with, grief and loss. And I'm glad you didn't mind me going to that place that for so many, like, we're blessed. You were sharing about how, you have a good relationship with your parents and your in-laws. There are a lot of people out there who don't speak to their parents very much, or their brothers or their sisters or their children or whatever it might be. They got broken relationships. And I feel like those broken relationships can really contribute to the loneliness epidemic that you mentioned, and a lot of mental health issues also. Like, people just don't feel loved and special and treasured and heard,
And I think that's I'm glad we are off record for this, but I really realize, and it's something I was talking to a friend about. I was like, in the world we live in, we constantly say, build boundaries, but to what extent? We've built such boundaries that people live in silos and they're unhappy and they're depressed and they're navigating these issues. No one's family is perfect. See, of course, if there's abuse and toxicity is different. Otherwise, no two people are going to be the same. Can we do that just a little bit?
Yeah.
Just a little bit. Again, like if it's an extreme situation, way different. But I think the world we live in, our tolerance for anything which is different from us, there's no room for difference. Whether it's politics, it's religion, it's relationships. Either we have a Siamese twins or we have no relationship. Unfortunately. So my parting 2 cents.
Well, have a beautiful afternoon there in New York, and
we can connect so that we let you know when this one's going to go live.
Yeah, we're going to launch this podcast series in July, so we'll let you know when this one goes up and tag you in a reel on Instagram and all of that.
Add me as a collaborator, so I do that for interviews. I love that because it's more people, more eyes.
Yeah,
I love it. And we'll put the book in there and all the things, and it's been wonderful to talk to you and to meet you. Thank you for all the work that you're doing to help the world. We appreciate it.
And if there's anything that we can do for you, let us know for sure.
Likewise. Thank you, and safe travels home next week.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Much.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.